I'm Quill History, and today we will explore the mythology of ancient Egypt, with its gods and goddesses. If you wonder what sources I'm using, the literature I'm referring to is listed in the description below. In this video we will cover what Egyptian mythology is, its connection to the Egyptian state and society, as well as the central gods of ancient Egypt and their function. Stay tuned for the end, where we will cover one of ancient Egypt's most prominent pharaohs, who attempted to start a religious revolution and overthrow the whole mythological worldview that had come before him. The simplest definition of what mythology is that mythology is a story that has an effect on people and society. This definition is of course too wide, and in the context of Egyptian mythology, we will instead define mythology as stories that are employed to understand or grasp a bigger reality. The core assumption in ancient Egyptian religion is that the cosmos is divine, and that all aspects of the world have gods associated with them, being usually referred to as polytheism, which means many gods. These gods are manifestations of different aspects of the world, but they are not necessarily identical with them. The Egyptians, like other ancient polytheists, could worship different gods at the same time, that by modern people would be seen as mutually exclusive. This, however, was not a problem for the ancient Egyptians, who instead saw the two god concepts as mutually beneficiary, being either different gods for the same thing, or different expressions of the same god. Egyptian mythology was by its nature inclusive, and Egyptian priests seldom discarded new concepts, which resulted in that Egyptian mythology evolved over time, becoming more complex, and the gods worshipped in 1500 BC were not necessarily the same ones who were worshipped in 2500 BC. To summarize, was Egyptian mythology not logical, but rather symbolic, and seemingly contradictory ideas could exist side by side without difficulty. Egyptian pantheons usually consisted of a collection of 9 different gods and is known as an Ennead. One of the most common Enneads in ancient Egypt was the Heliopolitan tradition, which symbolized how the world came to be, as well as the existing political order. According to the Heliopolitan tradition, the world started when the god Aten emerged out of the primeval waters. Aten then masturbated, put his sperm in his mouth and spitted it out. From this action came into being the twin deities of air, Shu and Tefnu, and from their union sprang the gods Geb and Nut, who were personifications of the earth and sky. Geb and Nut then gave birth to the twin couples Isis and Osiris, and Seth and Nephthys. Isis and Osiris would later give birth to Horus. The first thing one might notice is how outright bizarre some of the elements of the Heliopolitan tradition is, like Aten giving birth to the twin gods of air by spitting out his own sperm. This is because Egyptian creation accounts was not meant to be taken as literal description of how the world came to be, but rather as stories used to mediate fundamental truths about the universe, which becomes evident due to the fact that the Egyptians had several seemingly contradictory creation accounts that peacefully existed side by side. One of the most important aspects of Egyptian mythology was the legitimization and reinforcement of the rule of the Egyptian kings. According to Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris was the first king of Egypt after the creation of the world. The land prospered under his rule until he was murdered by his evil brother Seth, who was the god of chaos. With Osiris out of the way, Seth wreaked chaos and destruction on Egypt, which lasted until the god Isis miraculously managed to impregnate herself by the dead Osiris, and from that sexual intercourse she gave birth to the god Horus. Horus, who was a champion of order and justice, was horrified by the chaos that had befallen Egypt, and he challenged Seth to a combat in order to save Egypt from the turmoil that had befallen it. The battle was fierce as Seth and Horus fought it out, but in the end Horus was victorious, and he banished Seth out into the desert, thereby avenging his father Osiris and restoring order to Egypt. Horus would later revive his dead father Osiris, who would stay in the underworld to serve as god of the dead, while Horus would assume the title as king of Egypt. The story has several variations, but at its core is that a story about the living king Horus and his dead father Osiris. And in the context of the myth, every new Egyptian king was seen as a reincarnation of the god Horus, thereby linking the Egyptian pharaohs to a mythological past and stressing the pharaoh's role as a divine ruler and as the link between the people and the gods. One of the Egyptian king's central responsibilities was to uphold Maat. Maat was a central concept in the Egyptian mythology and refers to the embodiment of truth and the universal balance of the universe. The king upheld Maat by his interaction with the gods and his cult actions that he performed in the temple near the royal palace every day. The Egyptian pharaoh was therefore both a god, a king, as well as the Egyptian high priest, making ancient Egypt truly a kingdom of God. Egyptian religion and worship was of course not something that only the kings and priests engaged in, but also something in which ordinary Egyptians participated. Ordinary Egyptians had limited access to the temples and were normally only allowed into the outer courtyards. Most manifestations of personal religion were therefore remote from the great temples, and instead focused on solving the cares of everyday life, such as resolving disputes, praying for children, and medical cures. The means of contacting the gods by everyday people were intensely personal. One way to do this was by praying in a special shrouded area of the outer walls of the temples, where it was thought that the gods would listen. There also existed several religious shrines dedicated to certain gods, such as Hathor, Tooth, and Meretseger, where people could leave offerings to display their piety. Most of the Egyptian pharaohs, as with ancient Egypt itself, were for the most part pretty traditional, doing and holding to the same things as their predecessors. However, in year 1351 BC, one pharaoh who would break with nearly all of what his predecessors had held to was crowned. His name was Akhenaten, and he rejected the polytheistic worldview of his ancestors in favor for the worship of one single god called Aten. In rejecting the worship of the old Egyptian gods, the only existing connection between the divine and humanity was through Akhenaten, since he proclaimed that Aten only spoke to him, and his religion had thereby no religious texts or revelation, and instead centered around obedience to Akhenaten. Akhenaten's break with the Egyptian mythology can be seen in several areas. One area is art, where the earlier idealized art style was rejected in favor of a more naturalistic approach. Another area where this can be seen is in Akhenaten's persecution of the Egyptian gods. During his reign, Akhenaten several times sent out his servants to attack the old gods all over Egypt, and the way they did this was a rather odd way of conducting religious persecution. Akhenaten did not send out his servants to destroy idols or kill priests, but to chop away the names of the gods from buildings and monuments, even in places where no one could read them. This is because the ancient Egyptians had a very peculiar view on written text. Written text in Egyptian mythology is not only science that contains information, but also the mediator between the living and the dead, and erasing someone's name from the written records did not only mean that they were going to be forgotten, but also that they would either lose power or cease to exist. Sounds crazy, right? The ancient Egyptian view on written language was, as stated earlier, very peculiar, and it will take too long to do an in-depth cover of it here. Unfortunately for Akhenaten, his religious revolution did not last. He died in 1335 BC and left no male successors, and since he proclaimed that the only link between humanity and Aten was through him, his religion was doomed to perish. Soon after his death, Egyptian polytheism was re-established, and any remnant of Akhenaten's legacy was destroyed. That will be all for this video. I hope you liked it and that you learned something new about the ancient Egyptian gods and mythology. Don't forget that if you like this video and want to see more videos like it, hit the like, share and subscribe buttons.